These reforms represent the strongest consumer financial protections in history.
Washington politicians stood up and gave themselves a hand for a job well done when President Obama signed the Wall Street Reform Act. But as the congressional battle closes, a new one begins in a much less viewed setting, where over the next 2 years, federal regulators such as the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and the Securities and Exchange Commission will be filling in major blanks in the law by writing hundreds of new rules for Wall Street. It's a process that receives little public scrutiny, but it's well-known territory for lobbyists who are already making their arguments to the same regulators that failed to prevent the last financial crisis.
Rather than decide on a firm position, in 2010, Congress basically punted on it.
My guess is we're now moving into the second quarter.
Or maybe we're at halftime. I'd probably better say we're at halftime, and now the policymakers, the Capitol Hill is sitting down for the most part, and the regulators are going to take the court.
Scott Talbot is one of the top lobbyists in the fight. He represents the Financial Services Roundtable, the trade group for the nation's largest financial institutions. He says even though the congressional battle is over, some firms are now hiring even more lobbyists.
The regulators are ramping up, as are every interested party, both financial services industry as well as non-financial services industry. Everyone who has a comment to be made is gearing up to handle this tsunami of regulatory rules.
Congress instructed the regulators to write between 200 and 300 rules on everything from debit card fees to mortgages.
So we've got about half the bill has been left to the regulators. So the next 2 years will be critical in shaping the industry and implementing this new law.
Some worry Congress is leaving too much to the regulators.
The Fed had ample authority to prevent the buildup of the housing bubble. They blew it, basically. And this gets back to, one of the problems I think in this crisis, you can't count on the regulators.
We have given the regulators a very detailed framework. But I think, again, it would be presumptuous of us to start going down to the level, the micromanaging level.
But in Washington, the fine print can often determine winners and losers. Talbot says his lobbyists met with regulators before Congress even finished debating the bill. Other lobby shops approached the Fed about an upcoming rule that will determine the size of fees banks can charge on debit cards. In the law, Congress simply wrote that debit card fees should be reasonable. The definition of reasonable, Congress left that up to the Fed.
In lobbying, you have maybe 30 seconds or a minute to make your case or to talk about your arguments. With the regulatory process, you have pages and pages. You have 30, 40, 50, 100 pages to make your arguments.
And who's making these arguments? It just might be a former regulator. According to one recent report, about 150 former financial regulators are now registered lobbyists.
There clearly is a revolving door. The primary concern that I would have is the industry representatives are highly organized and well-funded.
Gary Eddles was a senior official at federal regulatory agencies for decades. He now teaches about the regulatory process at American University and says that when dealing with regulators, industry lobbyists have an edge over consumer advocates.
The business community is much better equipped to provide information, ostensibly objective information, to the agency than our consumer interests. I mean, if my mother-in-law has a serious problem over something, it's kind of tough for her to marshal all the data to demonstrate that this is a nationwide problem.
The Center for Public Integrity found that there are about 50 industry lobbyists for every one consumer advocate working on financial reform. And even President Obama recognizes the risks. As he signed the Wall Street Reform Bill, he acknowledged that the success of the law is now in the hands of bureaucrats.
For these new rules to be effective, regulators will have to be vigilant. No law can force anybody to be responsible. It's still incumbent on those on Wall Street to heed the lessons of this crisis in terms of how they conduct their businesses.